Welcome back for another deep dive.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, I think the reason everyone keeps coming back to these deep dives is because they really want to get to the bottom of things. They want to learn something without it feeling like they're, drowning in a sea of information.
Totally.
And something that's come up a lot in stuff that you guys have said to us lately is, we're always kind of adjusting how formal or informal we're being when we speak or write in English.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. It's something that we do subconsciously so often.
Yeah.
And it's actually, it's a really important skill in communication.
Yep.
Because you have to kind of know how to play that formality game.
Exactly.
So our goal with this deep dive is to help you understand those nuances of formal English, neutral English, and informal English so that you can use them appropriately and connect with people in the best way possible.
For sure. And the stuff we've been looking at, it does such a good job of breaking down these three levels.
Yeah.
I mean, just even some of the simple examples they give really drive it home. Like, asking someone, could I disturb you for a minute?
Right.
Compared to like, can I ask you something? Or just like a quick, you got a second?
Exact.
I mean, same underlying question.
Right.
But the way you're coming across is totally different.
Absolutely. And it really highlights how those subtle shifts can have a big impact on how your message is received.
Definitely. And something our source points out, which I think is a real trap, especially for people learning English, is the idea that more formal automatically equals more polite.
Yes.
Like, we need to unpack that a little bit because as we're going to get into, sometimes being super formal can backfire.
Totally. It's not always the best approach. Sometimes it can make you seem distant or even a bit condescending.
Exactly.
So let's dig into this idea that formality isn't just like a black and white thing. It's not just formal or informal. There's this whole spectrum.
Right.
Even within formal language, there are different levels.
Yeah, and the stuff we've been looking at gives a really nice example.
Yeah.
It talks about like asking someone, might I ask you something?
Okay.
Versus, may I take a moment of your time?
Right.
Or the one we just mentioned, could I disturb you for a minute?
Right. And so I think what's interesting is to think about the context of these different phrases. Might I ask you something? While grammatically correct, might actually be too formal for a lot of situations.
Yeah.
Particularly in modern professional settings. That level of formality might come across as a little bit almost subservient,
Yeah.
Like you're putting yourself in a lower position than the other person.
Right.
So it's interesting to think about the subtleties there. And like our source reminds us, it's not just the words.
Right.
It's the whole context. It's who you're talking to. It's even things like your tone of voice and body language.
Totally. So when we talk about being formal, what kind of situations come to mind for you? Like, when do you think, okay, maybe I should dial up the formality here?
Well, I think a lot of people would immediately say things like job interviews,
right,
important business meetings, when you're talking to somebody much older than you, or when you're writing an important email.
Sure.
Those are all kind of classic examples. Yeah. But as the source says, it always depends on the specific context.
It's never that simple.
It's never that simple. There's so many factors to consider.
And they make a really good point about different company cultures.
Yeah.
Like if you're interviewing at a very traditional hierarchical corporation with a real strong sense of protocol, then, dressing formally, speaking formally, probably a good signal.
Absolutely.
That you understand, you respect their culture.
Right.
But if you're, interviewing at a startup, maybe a more agile, informal environment, than being super buttoned up, could actually work against you.
Right. It might make you seem like you're not a good fit.
Yeah.
So, for you listening, how do you figure out what the right level of formality is?
Right, that's the $1 million question.
Well, the advice from our source is to pay attention to how other people are communicating.
Right.
So if everyone's being very informal, you probably don't want to be the one person who's super formal, and vice versa. If everyone's being quite formal and you come in with this really casual approach, it might come across as unprofessional.
Yeah.
And when in doubt, neutral language is usually a pretty safe bet because it's appropriate for a wide range of situations.
Exactly. So let's actually get into some of the nitty-gritty linguistic differences between these three levels.
Yeah.
And I think one of the clearest giveaways is sentence structure.
Right.
Like formal English tends to favor longer, more complex sentences.
Right. Those longer sentences can allow you to pack in more information.
Yeah.
And it creates a sense of careful consideration, which can be appropriate in formal contexts.
Right.
The source gives us a good example.
Okay.
They say, I was wondering if you could make yourself available on Wednesday to provide more detailed guidance on these matters.
Okay.
That's a pretty long sentence, right?
It is.
And it definitely sounds quite formal.
Definitely.
Now, compare that to a neutral way of saying the same thing. Do you have time on Wednesday to help us with these problems?
Yeah, much more straightforward.
Exactly, much more direct. And then the informal version is even shorter.
Okay.
Do you have some free time on Wednesday to talk about this?
Right, and it's using more everyday language.
Exactly.
Not so technical.
Not so technical. And the source gives us another little quiz.
Ooh, a quiz. I love quizzes.
They give us 3 sentences and ask us to figure out which one is formal, neutral, and informal.
Okay, hit me.
So the sentences are, we should have a word with him first. It may well be necessary to contact him before we make a decision. And we need to talk to him before we decide.
Okay.
Which one do you think is which?
Okay, I think we should have a word with him first. That sounds informal to me.
You got it.
Okay.
That's the informal one.
Okay, cool. And then I think the formal one is it may well be necessary to contact him before we make a decision.
You are on a roll.
Oh, that's absolutely right.
Leaving, we need to talk to him before we decide to be the neutral one.
Exactly. So you can see how sentence length and complexity are really good indicators of formality.
For sure.
And speaking of getting to the point, informal English often cuts corners even further.
Okay.
By just leaving words out, especially in questions.
Yeah.
Like instead of saying, are you sure? You might just say, you sure?
Right.
Or even just sure with a questioning tone. Yeah, and they give some other good examples like, will you be joining us? That feels very formal.
Very formal.
But then, are you coming?
That's neutral.
Yeah.
And then just coming is very informal.
Right.
And that kind of relies on the shared understanding between the speakers.
Yeah.
Which is something that informal language often does.
Exactly.
Here's another example. Do you have any suggestions?
Formal.
Formal. Have you got any ideas?
Neutral.
Neutra, and then just any ideas.
Informal.
Informal.
Love it. Okay, now let's talk vocabulary.
Okay.
I mean, that's a huge part of setting the tone.
Absolutely.
Whether it's formal, neutral, or informal.
Totally.
And what the source says is that formal English tends to use words that are a little more literary.
Right. Words that you might not use in everyday conversation.
Yeah.
Or even words that sound a little bit old-fashioned.
Right.
It's all about precision in formal English.
Okay.
You want to choose words that have a very specific meaning.
So it can feel a little less personal, almost.
Yeah, it can feel a little bit more distant.
Yeah.
Neutral English, on the other hand, uses simpler, more common words.
Right. Just getting the message across.
Exactly. Just being clear.
Clearly and simply.
Clearly and simply.
And then we have informal English.
Right.
Which also uses simple words, but it throws in things like slang, phrasal verbs, all that good stuff.
Colloquialisms.
Yeah.
It's a lot more relaxed.
Right.
And you might use a more general word, knowing that the context will make the meaning clear.
Yeah, and they give a great example about checking information.
Okay.
So in a formal context, you might say, we need to verify the data before we proceed.
Right. That's very formal.
Very formal.
Very precise language.
And then neutrally, it's like, we need to check the data before we continue. And then informally, it's, we need to check everything before we carry on.
Exactly.
Like, you can really hear the difference.
You can, and notice how in the informal version, it's everything instead of the data.
Right.
It's a bit less precise, but it still gets the point across.
Yeah.
And another great example is about asking someone to leave.
Oh, okay.
So the formal version is very official. You are required to collect your belongings and vacate the premises.
Right.
The neutral version is a bit softer. You need to take your personal possessions and leave the building.
Okay.
And then the informal version is very direct. You need to get your stuff together and get out.
Yeah.
So again, you see how the vocabulary becomes much simpler.
Yeah.
And less precise.
Right.
In the informal version.
Okay, so that actually leads nicely into
Does it?
Another key difference.
Yeah.
Which is directness.
Right.
And the use of personal pronouns.
Okay.
So formal language tends to be more indirect.
Right.
And impersonal.
Impersonal.
You don't see a lot of I, you, she.
Right. Those personal pronouns.
Exactly.
formal language often tries to avoid directly addressing people.
Yeah.
And there's also a greater tendency to use the passive voice.
Whereas informal language.
Informal language is much more direct and personal.
Right.
Sometimes even to a fault if you're not careful.
Yeah, exactly.
Neutral language, as usual, is somewhere in the middle.
Right in the sweet spot.
Right in the sweet spot.
Okay, so let's look at an example.
Okay.
The source gives us, lessons need to be learnt from the mistakes which were made.
Right.
So we've got that passive voice there.
We do.
No one's really taking ownership.
Exactly. Nobody's being blamed.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very impersonal.
Right, so that's formal.
Formal.
Then we've got, I hope you can learn from where you went wrong.
Neutral.
So there's a little bit of a you in there.
There is.
But it's not, too harsh.
Not too harsh.
And then you made a mess of this and you need to do better next time.
Informal and very direct.
Yeah.
And maybe a little bit aggressive, depending on the context.
Yeah, you got to be careful with that one.
Yeah.
But it shows how formal language tries to maintain that objectivity.
Yeah.
Distance, removing the individual.
Exactly.
And we see it again in this next set of sentences.
Okay.
We won't be able to do anything until we deal with these issues.
Neutral.
Neutral. Then we won't be able to get anywhere until you sort this out.
Informal.
And it may be difficult to make progress until these matters are resolved.
That's the formal one.
Yeah.
And again, you see how that formal version uses it to avoid directly addressing anyone.
Right.
It's all about that impersonal structure.
Yeah. So we've been talking a lot about spoken English.
We have.
But formality also plays a big role in written English.
It does.
And when we write, there are some extra things to think about.
Right.
Like informal writing.
Yeah.
Often uses contractions.
Right. Things like
Exactly. And abbreviations.
Yeah.
Like be truo, parade.
Exactly.
All those, text message and casual email shortcuts.
Right.
Formal writing generally avoids those.
It does.
It sticks to the full forms.
Right, to keep that more formal tone.
Yeah.
Neutral writing's kind of in between.
Right.
You might use contractions because they don't sound too informal.
Yeah.
But you'd probably avoid those very casual abbreviations.
Yeah.
Please for please.
Yeah, pleasy's never okay.
Never okay in formal writing. And the general rule of thumb is if you're unsure, just write it out.
Yeah, better safe than sorry.
Better safe than sorry.
And the source gives some really good written examples.
They do.
So we've got, just for your information, we'd like to schedule another meeting in October.
Okay.
No contractions, no abbreviations. Very formal.
Very formal.
Then, just for your information, we'd like to arrange another meeting in October.
Okay.
So we've got some contractions there, but no super informal abbreviations.
Right.
So that's neutral.
Neutral.
And then, just FYI, we'd like to fix up a meeting in Ox.
Informal.
Contractions and abbreviations galore.
Galore.
And they give one more great example about thanking someone for their work.
Okay.
So formally, it's thank you for all the hard work you have done.
Right.
Neutrally, it's thank you for the hard work you've done.
Okay.
And informally, it's thanks to fine for everything you've done.
Exactly.
So you can see even a simple thank you can be formal, neutral, or informal.
It can.
Depending on how you write it.
And the key thing to remember with writing is to get the tone right.
Yeah.
Because in writing, you don't have those vocal cues and body language to help convey your meaning.
Yeah, it's all about the words on the page.
Exactly. So if you're unsure, it's usually best to err on the side of neutral.
Yeah.
That way you're not too casual or too formal.
Right. Right in the middle.
Right in the middle.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
yeah,
I think what we've really seen is that formality in English.
Yeah.
It's not a simple either or.
Right.
It's this whole spectrum.
It's a spectrum.
And we've looked at all the different ways that this plays out in the language.
We have.
From sentence structure to vocabulary, even down to contractions and abbreviations.
And the big takeaway is that understanding these nuances can help you communicate so much more effectively.
For sure.
It allows you to choose the right register for any situation.
Yeah.
So you can avoid those awkward moments where you feel like you said the wrong thing.
Exactly. So here's something to think about.
Okay.
Think about a recent email you wrote or a conversation you had.
Right.
What level of formality did you use?
Yeah.
And thinking back now.
Yeah.
Do you think that was the right level for that situation?
Yeah, great question.
Just something to consider.
Just something to consider.
Because being more aware of formality
Yeah.
can really help us connect with people in a more meaningful way.
Absolutely. And a lot of these ideas came from an English Voice Club lesson.
Oh, cool.
So if you're interested in learning more, definitely check them out.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.